Hi, I'm Celeste, and this is the story. My sister married the man who once promised me forever, and the whole town believed her story because I stayed silent. But silence doesn't mean guilt, and showing up doesn't always mean revenge. Sometimes it simply means, I'm done letting lies live longer than they should. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever had to choose between peace and your own voice? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a story about dignity, truth, and the moment I took both back. I thought I had escaped the past, until the ivory envelope showed up at my mailbox, addressed in Sierra's perfect cursive. It had been nearly 2 years since I last saw her, or Daniel. Back then, I'd packed my car in the middle of the night and left town with nothing but a duffel bag and my dignity in tatters. I never imagined I'd hear from them again, let alone receive an invitation to their wedding. I stood on the porch of the cabin, the September wind rustling the golden leaves around me. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. My fingers hovered above the seal before finally breaking it open. Inside, their smiling faces were frozen in ink. Sierra's hand resting on Daniel's chest, her diamond ring glinting proudly. Together with their families, it read. I almost laughed. I wondered if Sierra had conveniently forgotten which family she'd shoved me out of. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat on the worn wooden steps, staring out at the edge of the woods where the trees stood still and silent. I'd spent the past 22 months rebuilding a life, simple, quiet, anonymous. I worked at the bookshop down the road. I learned how to split firewood. I spoke to the deer more than to people, and in that stillness, I had found something close to peace. But that letter, it pulled me right back. Celeste? Aunt June's voice rang from the gravel drive as her old Buick came to a stop. She still visited once every few months, bringing fig jam and unsolicited advice. She stepped out, a grocery bag in one hand, and eyed the envelope in mine. Is that what I think it is? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She set the bag down and sat beside me. Lord have mercy, she murmured, looking at the photo. They really went through with it. I offered no reply. I didn't trust myself to speak without bitterness. Aunt June sighed, patting my knee. You were always the kind one, even when people didn't deserve it. I swallowed hard. They'll say it's all in the past. They'll say what suits them, she said, her voice sharper now, but that doesn't make it the truth. She looked at me then, with eyes that had seen too much and lips pressed into a line of resolve. Are you sure you want to let everyone believe Sierra's story forever? I turned my face away, ashamed of how much the question shook me. I never planned to go, I said quietly, but maybe it's time someone told the truth. Driving back into Willow Creek felt like stepping into a photo I'd torn up years ago, one I wasn't sure I wanted to tape back together. The trees lining the road were ablaze with amber and russet, their colors too perfect, almost mocking. I slowed as I passed the sign, Welcome to Willow Creek. Its paint fading, but the memories it summoned were still painfully vivid. I hadn't expected to feel anything. I told myself I'd grown past it, but seeing the familiar corners of town made my hands tighten on the wheel. I didn't head straight to Aunt June's. Instead, I parked outside the Copper Kettle, the cafe where Daniel and I used to spend hours, coffee turning cold, conversations drifting like leaves outside the window. It looked the same, down to the chipped turquoise paint on the trim. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and espresso pulled at something buried deep in me. I'd barely stepped through the door when I heard a voice behind the counter. Celeste! I turned. Marcus Lane stood holding a camera, his brows raised in astonishment. He looked older, maybe broader in the shoulders, but the warmth in his voice was unchanged. "Marcus," I said, managing a small smile. "I thought you moved out west or something," he said, coming around the counter with a cautious grin. "Something like that." He handed off his camera to the barista and gestured to a booth. "Got a few minutes?" We sat, and he studied me like someone comparing a current photo to a memory. "Didn't expect to see you back, especially not for this." "I didn't plan to come," I admitted. "Then the invitation came, and I just needed to see." He hesitated, then leaned in. "I always thought it was strange. You and Daniel were solid, and then, bam! He's suddenly with Sierra? It never sat right." A silence fell between us. Then Marcus reached into his satchel and pulled out a small envelope. "You probably don't want these, but I never deleted them." Inside were glossy prints, photos from the fall 2 years ago. One stopped my breath. Daniel clasping a delicate gold necklace around my neck, his eyes only on me. My fingers trembled. "I remember this. Sierra said it was just a friendship necklace." Marcus's jaw tensed. "She asked me to erase those last year. Said you wouldn't want reminders." I stared at the image, a truth clicking into place. "She lied," I whispered, "and I have proof." Have you ever had someone rewrite your story while everyone around you clapped for the wrong version? If you've ever felt like your truth was quietly erased just to make someone else look better, leave a comment number 9 below. Now, let's see what happened next. The night before the wedding, Willow Creek was aglow with fairy lights and secrets. From the window of my room at the Rosewood Inn, I could see the warm shimmer of lights strung across the fence at the neighboring wedding venue. Laughter drifted on the night air, floating up from the rehearsal dinner like a memory I hadn't invited back. I was supposed to leave after tonight, slip away before the ceremony, before anything happens. That had been the plan. But Aunt June had other thoughts. She knocked softly, her gray cardigan draped over her shoulders like a cloak. In her hand was a folder, aged and creased. "I think you should see these," she said, settling into the armchair by the window. Inside were letters, dozens of them, familiar handwriting, earnest and boyish. Daniel's. My name is at the top of every page. I found them tucked inside an old recipe binder. "Your mother said Sierra must have accidentally forgotten them years ago," Aunt June said, her tone too even to be casual. I flipped through them, each line dredging up something I'd buried. Daniel had written me poetry. He spoke of promises, of futures. He'd asked me to meet his parents. He loved me. I never received a single one of those letters. "She stole them," I said, my voice barely more than air. She made sure I never knew. Aunt June reached over and held my hand. "She was always clever, but you were always kind. Don't let her silence win." Later, at the rehearsal dinner, I sat at the far end of a long wooden table, surrounded by laughter that didn't reach me. Candlelight flickered on mason jars. People clinked glasses and told stories about the happy couple. I watched Sierra from afar, radiant, confident, unaware. She never glanced my way. Marcus passed behind me and gently tapped the table. When I looked up, he smiled and mouthed, "Tomorrow is your day." Have you ever been in a room full of people and still felt completely alone, especially when your own family is leading the celebration? If that hits close to home, comment number 9, and let's keep going. Across the field, Daniel caught my gaze. His expression faltered, and for a second, I saw uncertainty, even regret, but he turned away. That night, I sat at the desk in my room, opened the hotel's stationery drawer, and wrote just a few lines. Nothing dramatic, just the truth. A truth she thought she'd buried. Tomorrow, I will speak, just once. Then I'd disappear. They say weddings are about beginnings. But before Sierra could speak her vows, I had something to say first. The sky over Willow Creek was impossibly blue that morning, like it had been scrubbed clean for the occasion. Rows of white chairs lined the garden behind the old barn, flanked by bursts of golden mums and deep red maple leaves. I sat near the back, quiet, my palms resting on the letter I had folded twice and slipped into my coat pocket. Sierra stood at the altar, radiant in lace and illusion, her hair pinned just so. Daniel looked handsome, if slightly strained, like a man trying to remember why he was here. The officiant raised his hands, calling for the ceremony to begin. I stood. The wooden chairs creaked as heads turned toward me. "Before the vows," I said, my voice steady, "may I speak for just a moment?" Sierra's smile flickered. Daniel's brows drew together. "I'm not here to disrupt this wedding," I said, walking toward the front. "I'm here to reclaim the truth." I pulled the letter from my pocket. Daniel's letter, written years ago, never meant to be lost. I read a short passage aloud about a necklace, a promise, a night under the stars. His words, his handwriting. "You once gave me this," I said, reaching into my palm to reveal the modest silver chain he had gifted me, called later by Sierra, a friendship trinket. Sierra's lips parted in protest, but no words came. She looked like someone whose trick had been pulled from under her, yet I felt no satisfaction, only release. "I'm not here to accuse," I continued. "Daniel, you had the right to choose, but I had the right to not be erased." The silence that followed was deep. Aunt June sat upright in the crowd, her chin lifted with quiet pride. Marcus, near the back, lowered his camera slightly, letting the moment breathe. Daniel looked at the letter, then at Sierra, then at me. He reached for his boutonniere, white rose and baby's breath, and carefully removed it from his lapel. "I can't do this." The chairs were still warm, the champagne untouched, but the wedding was over before the cake was even cut. I slipped away before the murmurs could settle. The air outside the barn felt cooler now, touched with early evening chill. I walked toward the edge of the property, where the trees began again, their leaves dancing gently, as if unaware of the ceremony that had unraveled in front of them. Aunt June found me first. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me her cardigan like it was the most natural thing to do. "You didn't ruin anything today," she finally said, her voice soft. "You gave them a chance to build from honesty." I wanted to believe that. Marcus arrived next, giving me a nod from a distance, hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't push. That was something I liked about him. Even back in school, he never filled silence with noise. Then Daniel came. He walked slowly, like someone approaching something fragile. I stayed seated on the porch step of Aunt June's house, hands folded in my lap. "I was a coward," he said, stopping just a few feet away. "I let someone else's version of you decide everything." I didn't speak right away. His apology wasn't dramatic, just honest. And that made it heavier. "I forgive you," I said, looking him in the eye. "But forgiveness doesn't always come with a return ticket." He nodded, blinking more than usual. Then he turned and walked away. No pleading, no second try. Just a man letting go. Later, as the sun began to lower, Marcus stepped beside me. "Walk?" he asked, like it was a simple thing. We moved along the path near the woods, where the golden light broke through branches and touched the earth like a blessing. "Do you think people can begin again?" I asked, watching our shadows stretch ahead of us. "Only when they stop pretending they never broke," he replied. I smiled. I guess I've just begun again. 3 weeks later, the leaves had turned, the gossip had cooled, and I had just signed the lease on my first studio downtown. The space smelled faintly of old wood and dust when I first opened the door, but sunlight spilled across the worn floorboards like a promise. I ran my hand along the windowsill, already picturing where the pottery wheel would go, where the shelves would sit heavy with glaze-speckled mugs and bowls, imperfect and beautiful. I didn't leave Willow Creek. Turns out I didn't need to. Aunt June lent me the seed money, no contract, no pressure, just a folded check and a whisper, "Do something good with it." So I did. By the end of the second week, the studio had a heartbeat. The chalkboard sign outside read Whisper Clay, workshops and community. Kids wandered in after school with smudged fingers and open curiosity. One of them, a tiny girl named Elise, liked to sit near the front window and paint quietly while I worked. Marcus stopped by almost every morning, coffee in one hand, rolled up posters in the other. "Marketing department, at your service," he joked, pinning up flyers for the weekend classes we planned, some for children, some for the elderly. "You wouldn't believe how many retirees want to try pottery," he grinned one morning. I laughed, watching him tape up another flyer. It didn't feel like a beginning or an ending, just something gently unfolding. Sierra had left town quietly, and Daniel mailed me a card. Just a simple note saying, "I hope you find peace here. I never meant to take that from you." I didn't need more. One afternoon, Elise tugged on my apron and handed me a folded piece of paper. A drawing of a smiling woman with clay-covered hands. Underneath, in a wobbly crayon, it read, "Miss Celeste is kind. She tells the truth." I had to turn away for a moment, not because it hurt, because it healed. I didn't get the life I once imagined. I got something quieter, smaller, maybe, but deeply, truly mine. Some wounds don't shout. They settle in quietly, asking only to be acknowledged. For me, healing began not with confrontation, but with the courage to speak gently where I was, once silenced. Sometimes, truth doesn't tear things apart. It sets them straight, like pulling a painting into the light after years in the shadows. When we stop judging by appearances and start listening with grace, even broken stories can grow whole again. Like a handmade cup, still warm from the kiln, kindness doesn't need to be perfect to be real. If this story reminded you of a time you stood alone with your truth, or supported someone who did, share that memory in the comments below. And if you'd like to walk through more stories like this one, consider subscribing. There's always a seat here for those who believe in quiet strength and second chances.